Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Um, I'm Maureen Ryan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I am so pleased and thrilled today to be joining you for our election post-mortem. And we're going to get started in just a moment. I have a few comments, just logistical comments. You know, we do events every Friday at this time. Many of you have probably been here before and know the drill. If you are new to our events, we're doing this on YouTube Live. And there's a comment function, just like you would comment on any YouTube video. Feel free to leave your questions, comments for our panel of experts in the YouTube discussion. I will be popping it back and forth and bringing those questions into the discussion we're having here in this small Zoom meeting. And so there'll be plenty of opportunities for dialogue and engagement. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our speakers. This has been certainly the strangest week of my life, probably many of your lives. And I also want to take a moment. Our Dean of Students at UW has provided some resources that he wanted me to share. So our Dean of Students is Adam Jessel, and he put together an election, or the Office of the Dean of Students put together an election self-care plan, which I think is really useful for all of us, actually. So it's the first comment in our YouTube chat. It's the link to the election self-care plan, and it just has some resources for dealing with stress. There are some that are specific to UWM and UWM students, but others are not. So please, if you're feeling overwhelmed and anxious, like so many of us are, take a look at that. It might be useful to you. So having said that, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. We have an incredible array of scholars who are going to help us parse and make sense of not only the big picture of this election, right, but also some of the more down ballot issues that are taking up less of the air. I think some of those things are going to be really important to discuss too. So with us today, we have Thomas Holbrook, who is Distinguished Professor and Wilder Crane Professor of Government and Political Science at UW-Milwaukee. We have Anna Sampaio, who's the Director and Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies and Political Science at Clara University in California. And we have David Redlawsk, who's James R. Soules Professor of Political Science at the University of Delaware. And moderating our discussion is C21 Director and Distinguished Professor of English, Richard Grusin. And with that, I will turn it over to Richard.
Thanks, Maureen. Being moderate is not usually one of my skills, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, I'm going to actually make a little presentation to begin with, because I've been working for more than a decade on the question of mediation in politics, and arguing that politics and media are inseparable in the US and elsewhere, if not indistinguishable. And I think that's more so than ever in the 21st century. With only minor exceptions like political rallies or direct encounters with candidates, everything we know about our nation's politics comes to us through print, televisual, and socially networked media. As Marshall McLuhan pointed out in reference to the Kennedy-Nixon debates in 1960, Kennedy's cool appearance on the cool medium of television was instrumental in his close victory. Although some people say it was also the penchant of my hometown Chicago to make sure that even the dead voted for Democrats. It's arguable that in every election since 1960, Americans have elected the candidate for president that they most wanted to watch in the role of president on TV. In 2017, I published an article called Donald Trump's Evil Mediation, in which I argued that Trump won the Republican nomination and then the presidency by dominating what might be called the media real estate. In the primaries, he received more media coverage and attention than all of his Republican opponents combined. This imbalance continued in the general election against Hillary Clinton. My argument in that piece is that the overwhelming presence of Trump in the news made it seem as if he was already president. Although much of the coverage was negative, even this negative coverage served to legitimate him and make him seem more like he was president than Clinton did. Over much of the first term, Trump dominated the nation's media screens. Again, despite the critical tenor of the majority of the coverage, the media could not take their eyes or ears off of him. As he had in the 2015-2016 presidential campaign, Trump took all the air out of the room. While the impeachment hearings and the trial took the focus away from his image, he still remained the center of the American media world. Although I had thought that if Pelosi had stretched that out longer in terms of hearings and stuff, that it might have had more effect. But she didn't need to, because something really unexpected happened, kind of like in any long-form TV series, which is really what we've been watching here. We had two remarkable turns. The first was COVID-19. All of a sudden, the news media was more concerned with the dangers of the pandemic than with the threats of Trump's terroristic, outrageous tweets. Recognizing this himself, Trump began to appear at lengthy COVID briefings every afternoon, trying to retake some of the precious media real estate that he had involuntarily surrendered to COVID. COVID, right? But he failed miserably as the facts of the government's incompetent handling of the pandemic countered his baseless claims about having controlled the disease or of how COVID would just go away when the weather got warm. And then on top of that, Jacob Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police. And while this is not a new event in the United States, that murder and its visibility, the fact that it was presented on video across our media screens, worked to trigger widespread political protests and social unrest. Well, again, Trump tried to take control of the media space by demonizing the millions of Americans who are agitating for racial justice. He again failed to recapture the same share of media space he'd been commanding. Indeed, at long last, media outlets began cutting off his speeches, his news conferences, and other disinformation efforts. Along with many other factors, Biden's impending victory has been due both to Trump getting less time on TV and other media outlets, and to people simply turning him off in disgust. The Trump show had jumped the shark. So we find ourselves this afternoon performing a post-mortem on an electoral body that still has a pulse, if only barely. I've been thinking a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. We may still hear the beating of that heart. While many of us are frustrated, and we're actually talking about that in the green room before the event, while many of us have been frustrated by the hesitancy of the mainstream news media finally to call the election for Biden, this now 4-day coverage of the electoral count is emblematic in that it's kept Trump's voice and image off of our screens. It's really decentered him in favor of these numbers over and over, even decentering the COVID count. So much so that all the major news outlets cut Trump off yesterday when he started lying about electoral fraud in his afternoon appearance. What has likely bothered him almost as much as losing is that he's not been at the center of the media world's attention. When the election is called for Biden, perhaps just in time for his televised speech to the nation tonight in prime time, Trump will explode, and the media will most likely cover that. And while it's unclear how extensively he will continue to contest the results, he's certain to seek to capture the media real estate in the lame duck period with imaginable and unimaginable presidential actions. But for now, we can only lapse into speculation and premediation of what might come. Rather than continue down that road, let me now turn the floor over to the other three members of our roundtable, each of whom have more expertise in political matters than I do. And despite the order that they were introduced, I think we had agreed that David Redlawsk would speak first, then Anna Sampaio, and then Thomas Holbrook. So, David, take it away.
Thanks very much, Richard. And Maureen, thanks for inviting me and for putting together this fantastic panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing what the other two have to say. And I think your comments, Richard, are really quite interesting as well. I find this idea of the media and Trump and politics all wrapped together in a single bundle to be really interesting, and I think kind of on point for the last now 5 years or so. I guess we can start by saying that I'll put it here. Despite the fact that the AP has not called this election, although they've called Arizona while others have not, and others have called other states, I see no world in which Donald Trump pulls this off. It seems very clear to me at this point that Biden has a big win. And even though it feels like it's not a big win because we've got all these states that seem and are fairly close in the count at this point, the reality is going to be by the time all the votes are counted, firstly, he's already won more votes than any presidential candidate has ever won. Secondly, the margin between him and Donald Trump is likely to be in the range of 6 million or more votes. So, by presidential election standards, this is a big win. And what's really interesting about this to me is that this is a guy who spent 30 plus years running for president. It's worth remembering that he contested the 1988 presidential election. It didn't last terribly long because of what now seems a really quaint controversy over plagiarism in a speech. I mean, today that's hard to imagine that would sink a campaign. And so he was out in 1988. He came back to run again in the 2008 cycle. I was living in Iowa at the time. I interacted with him a number of times, watched him a number of times. He just, there was no path for him in 2008. There were too many other really interesting things going on. A guy named Barack Obama, a woman named Hillary Clinton, and even John Edwards, who was running for the second time. And so, he did horribly in Iowa relative, and so who would have thunk it? And I didn't. I spent the run up to the caucuses, the 6 months ahead of the caucuses in Iowa this time around. So last fall, from the Iowa State Fair in August right through to the inconclusive caucus night. And I went to many Joe Biden events, watched this really carefully, and honestly, it just wasn't clear that he had put together anything approaching the kind of campaign, not in terms of winning in Iowa, but that was even going to go further. Like many others, and certainly like the folks in the media, I badly underestimated what that campaign was doing and what its targets and goals were. And obviously, he was contesting Iowa because he had to, not, I think, because he wanted to, right? If, when we see what happened in South Carolina and going after that, that's the story. And so the African-American women in particular in South Carolina propel Biden in the primaries. African-Americans, probably particularly African-American women in Georgia, may be putting the icing on the cake. But it is absolutely fascinating that he, after 30-something years, appears to have finally made it. Part of the story, of course, is what looks like an absolutely gigantic turnout, right? By U.S. presidential election standards, it looks like on a percentage of the voting population, the eligible voting population, this will be the highest in 120 years, which essentially means the highest since we've had anything approaching a secret ballot modern presidential election system. But the interesting thing is Biden isn't the only one who benefited from that. Donald Trump benefited from that. Both of the numbers are up. And rather than the Democrats having some overwhelming wave, right? Down ballot, there's a lot of frustration. There are essentially bifurcated results here, right? A large victory for Biden, popular vote margin flipped states, but losses in the House of Representatives, failure apparently, at least so far, to pick up the Senate, and probably more importantly and less covered, failure to make headway at the state legislative level. Why does that matter? Because we're into a redistricting cycle. And so by Democrats not making headway, Republicans retain control to redistrict a significant share of the congressional districts in the country, which could make things difficult for Democrats going forward. So Democrats are in this really weird sense, right? They should be very excited about Joe Biden, about winning the presidency, but they're also very depressed about losing seats in Congress, losing down ballot. And I think understanding what happened there is going to keep a lot of people busy for a while. But I'll give you my very quick, simple answer to this on the down ballot, and that is that politics is personal, right? So COVID comes and COVID stops the campaigning in its tracks, particularly for the Democrats. We're making a big point out of needing to follow public health regulations, be very careful, right? Care about the community. And so all of a sudden you can't knock on doors. I'm not sure door knocking matters a whole lot for a presidential campaign. It might not matter a whole lot for a US campaign, except in tiny states like, say, Delaware. But it absolutely matters for state legislative campaigns in many, many states around the country. And especially, I'll use Iowa as the example, right? Because I truly thought Iowa was going to be far closer than it was. But an Iowa House district is about 29,000 people, not even voters, but people. A Senate district is 58,000. You can knock on every single door in your district. And Iowa House and Senate candidates usually do. The Democrats stopped, the Republicans did not. So the Democrats tried to do what they thought was the appropriate move, right? To take care in a pandemic. And the Republicans said, we're still going to knock on doors. Democrats said, well, we can do this electronically. We can do this, over the internet. I have a son of mine actually worked for the Iowa Democratic Party in this cycle as the out-of-state volunteer coordinator. They made more than 3 million phone calls and millions of texts to Iowa voters, right? But they didn't knock on doors. And I honestly, without data, I think that's a big part of the problem down ballot, right? You didn't have the personal campaigning. Last thing I'll comment on right now is thinking about process a little bit. And it's a little bit to Richard's points in some sense, although I am not, I am a very empirical scholar. And so some of Richard's stuff goes a little over my head perhaps, but I think process on this voting matters immensely, not on the actual voting, not even on the mail voting, but on the back end. So imagine if no votes were reported until all were counted. Let's just imagine we had a system like that. No one can report votes until they're all counted. We know immediately who won. We have no stories about the horse race, about who's ahead, who's falling behind, who's catching up. Oh no, it's going to be this much more. No, it's that much more, right? Instead of that, of course, what we get is an imagined race. We get an imagined race that something is still happening when all the votes have already been counted. Or not counted, cast. Every vote has been cast, but we just don't know the outcome. So we have days and days of imagination about what might happen. And the media gets the opportunity to keep the eyeballs, keep the clicks, keep the thing going for as long as they possibly can. Now, you could say, well, we had all these mail-in votes. It was going to take a long time to count them. Okay, imagine that across the nation, every state prepared to count the mail-in votes ahead of time, just like Florida. 22 days ahead of the election, Florida Florida starts preparing the mail-in votes for counting. And guess what? Florida had its full results up on election night. So did Iowa. Right? Pennsylvania, on the other hand, through political decisions made by the legislature, could not even start opening envelopes until election day. And so we are still getting the count in Pennsylvania. We are still having a horse race, but I guarantee you the election was actually over on November 3rd. We just didn't know and still don't know for sure. I'll turn it back to you, Richard.
I'm just going to hand it right to Anna. Or Anna, you are on.
I respond to both. Thank you. Thank you to Richard, to Maureen, to everybody here, to everybody who's listening. This has been an exhausting week, but it does feel like we're on a path that's already been carved out. And now, as David and others have mentioned, it's really just a matter of when we get there, and hopefully sooner rather than later. There's three really big points that I want to make looking at this election, and then of course we can flesh these out in conversation and questions. But starting where David left off, which is really about the structure and the process, that given what this country has been faced with, given the burden on election commissions and secretaries of state, it is a remarkable thing that we've gone through is a largely successful election, that the process itself it turned out to be relatively smooth. You know, the pandemic and the need to shift quickly to a larger than normal volume of ballots. In some states, they went from 5% absentee ballots to 50% absentee ballots, and had to, you know, move through a lot of new infrastructure, training, all of which had to be done within the context of social distancing and fears about the rising spread of COVID. That given all of that, it was a remarkably well-run election that we went through, this general election, in stark contrast to what we saw in the primary, right? This election likely will result in far fewer ballots being invalidated, far fewer, at least systematic problems and discrepancies than what we've seen in the past. And that is something really to hold up and to champion that process went as smoothly. But we also need to remember that this stands, as I said, in stark contrast, not only to the primaries and what people faced in the primaries and the extraordinarily long lines in the primaries, but that there has been this systematic form of targeted disenfranchisement over really the last 15 years since the Shelby decision in 2013. And that kind of voter disenfranchisement has been targeted disproportionately at voters of color, Black and Latino voters, as well as young voters. And we're talking about these really complex systems, from racial gerrymandering to voter ID laws, to polling place closures, to proof of citizenship requirements and voting rule purges, to simply cuts in early voting, and all of which have happened in this very complex and systematic way, to the point that even Stacey Abrams notes they have collectively been almost normalized in election discourse, right? We've come into this election cycle with those systems already in place, having already disenfranchised so many voters, and yet there isn't a sort of collective cognition of the fact that people in Georgia, for instance, faced all of those systems and still turned out and still are carrying this race for Democrats and likely carrying two of these Senate races into a runoff, right? So there is this process that went relatively smooth, and yet this incredible series of obstacles that have been so thoroughly entrenched and normalized in our system that I think we really need to keep in the back of our mind and think about as we move to the next phase of election reform. The second point that I really want to make is that for all of this deeply divisive, as Richard noted, openly racist, sexist, misogynistic, xenophobic discourse, and the policies that accompany that in the Trump administration, despite the open embrace of white nationalism, the targeting of racial and ethnic minorities for violence, and the admissions of sexual assault, Trump not only retained much of his base of support among both white men and women, he actually expanded it. right? So the initial exit polling data suggests that he receives about 57% of the white votes, 58% of white men, and 55% of white women, which, if that turns out to be true, would actually be a gain over the support he receives from white women in 2016. And it's not because, you know, I think there is this idealization in the country that there would be this repudiation of the administration, not only for the catastrophic mishandling of coronavirus and the collapse of the economy, but certainly for his open embrace of this kind of racist and sexist discourse, that this would be a campaign that would be effectively a referendum. And it turns out that's just not true, that there is this stronghold of racial resentment that still is very active in this country. And it's not because that gets walked back, but rather because of the coordinated work of hundreds of voter organization and voter mobilization and outreach efforts that we see, as David mentioned, an increase of voters in this particular election cycle. And again, the exit polls indicate that in that radical expansion of new voters, 66% of them supported Biden. So it is the expansion of the electorate, and particularly among young, sorry, you can hear my chickens in the background here. My quarantine chickens are wanting to participate here. Younger voters, Latino voters, Black, and sometimes what is referenced as low propensity voters. It is the targeted mobilization of that population that is really making the difference across the board, but particularly in these targeted states: Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Washington, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Colorado, New Mexico, and of course, Pennsylvania. I would be remiss if I didn't note that that kind of work, while Stacey Abrams has been appropriately credited with so much of that work in Georgia, that work happened in so many states, effectively in all 50 states, but particularly in these battleground states. And much of that work happened precisely because women of color showed up, and women of color were organizing in their communities, in not just groups like Fair Fight, but in Lucha, and Mi Gente, Voto Latino, Indivisible. It was young people and women of color who were doing that kind of backbreaking mobilization, outreach, coordinated work, and not just in this election cycle, but for the last several years that we see the output of that. As a result, we've got a larger population of Black and Latino voters who turned out, and frankly turned out, at least from the outset, to be decisive in this election. Latino voters, for instance, grew from approximately 12.5 million voters in 2016 to what will likely be somewhere between 15 and 16 million voters in 2020. More than 2.1 million additional Latino voters were added to the electorate in this particular election cycle, making them the largest group of non-white voters in the country in this election cycle, something that hasn't necessarily been as thoroughly, I think, debated and discussed in this election. As a consequence, there's a great deal of talk and frankly misunderstanding about Latinos in particular, some of which is driven by a lack of reliable data. We can talk at length about what's been happening with the National Election Pool and how unreliable that data has been for decades when it comes to evaluating Latinos. And to be fair, Edison, research has long said we should not use that data for making generalizations about these subpopulations, and yet that happens in media regularly. And so as in part because of the lack of this reliable data, particularly in the National Election Pool, and over generalizations made upon small samples, we get a lot of misunderstanding, particularly about Latinos, not the least of which happens in the New York Times, right? If you saw the last couple of days, New York Times effectively attributing the loss of Texas and Florida to the Latino population. To which I need to remind people that you please do not generalize from just one county. Miami-Dade in particular represents only 3% of the total Latino population. And among the preponderance of the remaining 97% of the population in the country, Biden did extremely well. And he did on par with, if not in some cases, elevated numbers in Latino support. For instance, the state of Arizona, the Latino population is about 3.8%. It's a larger and more critical population than the Miami Latino vote. and Biden receives approximately 75% of Latino support in that state. Colorado flips a U.S. Senate seat entirely because of the Latino vote. Nevada stayed blue because Biden won the Latino vote. New Mexico elects a Latino U.S. senator because of the Latino vote. In short, the Latino vote exists in all 50 states, and political pundits need to be careful to not essentialize or reduce the entirety of this complex population to Miami Cuban voters and make unwanted generalizations about that. So the last thing I would say here is really we're talking about a very complex population with lots of variations. And this election cycle, if no else, is really an invitation for people to really understand these racialized and gendered dimensions and to delve more deeply into an understanding of these populations. So I'll leave it there and we can get more into questions.
All right, Tom, you're up.
Great, thank you. Thanks for all the wonderful comments everybody has already given. Fortunately, you didn't talk a lot about exactly what I planned on, so I actually have a couple of things to contribute here. So Dave Redlawsk in his comments talked about the sort of scope of the win, the magnitude of the win, and described it as a big win. And probably Biden will go on to win the popular vote, I don't know, maybe 3.5, 4, maybe even 5 percentage points. They're still counting a lot of votes. At least a quarter of the votes in California haven't come in. About a quarter haven't come in New York. So that popular vote margin is going to grow, grow, and grow nationally. The bad news for the Democrats, though, is they barely won, right? I mean, yeah, they win that popular vote by large numbers, bigger numbers probably than we've seen in a long, long time. But for a few thousand votes in a few states, they're this close to losing this election, okay? And that's a problem for the Democrats. You know, it wasn't so long ago, Republicans used to complain a lot about the blue wall, the wall of states that somehow gave the Electoral College to Democrats. Yeah, and this after decades of Democrats bemoaning, they didn't call it a red wall then, but the solid South and how it was impossible for Democrats to win. The truth is there was never a blue wall. There was a blue, maybe snow fence that was really, really porous, you know? And if you had a good winter, the snow wouldn't get through, right? And it just so happens that this time around, nationally, that the national ticket is strong enough, national conditions favor Democrats enough that they're able to get over the hump in some of these really close places. Now imagine if this turned out a little bit differently and Biden won the national vote by 1.5 points. He loses Pennsylvania. He loses Georgia. He might lose Georgia anyway, I don't know. He loses Arizona. He loses Nevada. He loses Wisconsin. He could lose Michigan and still, again, win the popular vote. And I think it's important to think about that and for Democrats to remember that this is a problem they have. They have no problem winning popular votes nationwide, no problem at all. In the last 8 elections, including this one, Republicans have won the popular vote once, which is why Republicans will never work with Democrats to get rid of the Electoral College. It's their shot. It's their shot, okay? What's the line? I'm not going to waste my shot, or something like that from Hamilton. So it's really interesting to think about this in the context in which this election takes place. And Richard, you talked about this to some extent, and actually everybody did too. So you had a president who lost the plurality vote. He was somebody else got more votes than him last time. His approval ratings, you know, on average, never really got above 45%, sort of consistently across polls. The least popular president ever. A public health crisis breaks out probably broke out in January, but really came into our lives in March and just gets worse and worse and worse as we get close to the election. A public health crisis for which there's no real national strategy at all. And so you might think, well, this guy's going to get a real repudiation. And in one way, he is the popular vote. That's a repudiation. Although, you know, losing the popular vote even by 4 or 5 or 6 percentage points, given that context, might still be overperforming a little bit. Okay. But going forward, this is a continuing problem for Democrats. You've got to work really, really hard to put together this coalition of states. Got to work really, really hard. And I think Democrats know this, and I think they also know, and this follows up on some of Anna's comments, that a lot of this is about really intense targeting of traditionally very loyal Democratic groups to get them out to vote. And I think they've done a good job this time around. Although, as Dave pointed out, there's lack of door knockers, and it's more than just lack of people knocking on doors. There were no field offices. Trump campaign had, I think I saw somewhere 250 field offices around the country. And I say around the country, I mean probably in about 10 states, maybe not even 10 states. And those field offices, of course, they're responsible for a lot of the door knocking and so on, but they're also responsible for local organization and they can be very important. So I think Dave's probably right. This had an impact down ballot. It may have even had some impact on the presidential race. It's a little hard to know. On the other hand, the Biden campaign sure had a lot more money to spend on advertising. It seems crazy to say this out loud, but one of the findings from political science, I don't know if it's accepted by everyone, but one of the findings is that advertising doesn't matter very much. Okay. And one of the reasons is that usually both sides are doing it, and there's a lot of it, and so on balance, maybe it's a wash. Okay. But that seemed to be advertising, and then digital campaign was taking the place of field offices and door knocking. So, the good news for Democrats is, yes, they won. It looks like they won once all the votes are counted. But there's no resurrecting the blue wall. There never was a blue wall. Okay, there's a group of states that, in the right conditions with the right amount of effort, Democrats can get to go in their direction. But it wouldn't take very much for this election to turn the other way if Biden was just a little less successful nationally. Or maybe if libertarian candidates weren't on the ballot in some states. And I'm absolutely serious about that. The libertarian candidate in Pennsylvania is probably going to get a little over 1% of the vote. So this is how close it is. This is how close it is when the Democratic candidate's probably going to win by 6-8 million votes, but just barely going to win the election. So, I mean, that's, yes, for Democrats, feel good, take a deep breath, enjoy that in this moment, but it's not over. It's not over by a long shot. I just want to comment on a couple of trends that, one election doesn't make a trend, right? But the white share of the electorate was way down this time around. And again, I mean, this is based on the exit polls, and those things tend to change a little bit over time as they incorporate more precinct level weighting and so on. But right now, it looks like the white share of the electorate was about 65%. That's down a lot from 4 years ago. This time around, I was very surprised to see that men were almost evenly split between Biden and Trump. Trump won men by 1 percentage point. I don't know if that's the beginning of anything, but it's certainly, for a candidate who depended upon the male vote, especially the white male vote. My lights went off here. Hang on. Oh, well, maybe there we go. Okay. The white male vote. White men are over time less and less of the electorate. And at least in this case, men overall seem to have split evenly between the two candidates. Generational replacement going forward is another real problem for Republicans. Anna mentioned new voters going overwhelmingly for Biden. A lot of these are young voters. In the last couple of election cycles, that 18 to 29 year group has been increasingly Democratic. And as that works its way through the sort of electoral python, it's replacing the older generation, which is more conservative, more Republican. So, I mean, that's a long-term trend. Those are both long-term trends that the Republican Party has to sort of reconcile with. it's possible as they continue to sort of lose the popular vote, they can string together electoral college victories. But I think just in terms of the broader population trends, and this is not a new observation, the deck is really kind of stacked against them. And just one last thing I want to say, because I'm sure there are lots of questions. I want to just comment on polling. Pollsters, this is not a good time to be a pollster. We're starting to hear grumbling about the polls, most of which pointed to a pretty decisive Biden victory, which is actually how it's turning out in the popular vote, a decisive Biden victory. So there's that. But similar to 2016, there's a lot of error in the state polls, error that favors Biden a lot more. In fact, in other words, overestimated Biden's share, even to a greater extent than overestimated Clinton's share 4 years ago. I follow these things a lot. My forecasting model is based on using state polls that other people do. And I think similar to 4 years ago, one of the things to think about is that it's entirely possible that polls that we refer to as wrong were in fact right when they were taken. Take the Marquette poll here in Wisconsin. The last poll was released Thursday before the election, so I think probably the last day in the field was Tuesday, so a week before the election. It showed Biden up by 5 points in Wisconsin. Biden might have been up by 5 points in Wisconsin then. It could have been absolutely accurate. And especially this year, looking at the exit polls, people who decided in the last week of the campaign, and this was a small share, this is a lot smaller group than 4 years ago, but those people favored Trump by 15 percentage points. That's enough, if you don't poll close enough to election day, that's enough to make a poll that is correct at the time it's taken appear to be incorrect on election day. So I guess I'm sort of urging a little patience with pollsters we think were wrong. They might not have been when the polls were taken. That's, I think, it for me for right now.
Great. Thank you all. I think we could probably talk among ourselves for quite a while, but I understand that there are comments in the audience, and that will also give us a chance to talk among ourselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Maureen and let her moderate this part of the debate.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you to all of our panelists. This has really been, I don't know, it's putting me in a better mood than I've been in all week, just to have clarity on some of these issues. So we do have some comments I want to bring in, and actually, because I am able to, I am going to build on some of these comments to ask a question of my own, which I think is kind of latent in some of these comments. So Anika Wilson, this is actually in reference, I believe, to, excuse me, to Richard's original comments about the Trump show and the ways in which Trump is able to kind of like captivate media attention in very particular ways that are central to his success as a candidate. Anika Wilson said she's canceling her subscription to the Trump show. And Stuart Moulthorpe says, beware the reboot. And I actually would love to think about that a little more concertedly, because one of the things that I know, it's like insane to start thinking about 2024, but in a way it's not, right? Because what the Republican Party is going to have to do now is reckon with itself and how profoundly the Trump brand and message and image has reoriented the entire party. So now it is the party of white supremacy. It's the party of white nationalism. It's the party of voter suppression. And that's really popular with a certain group of voters who now have come to expect that from the party. And I wonder if they are going to find a way to put that cat back in the bag and become about other things. Do you think that this is the moment for Don Jr. to step in? I mean, I guess I'm not asking you to predict the future, but to think about what are the possibilities and the options for the Republican Party in some future when they're going to have to kind of reimagine their role in our democracy.
I don't have an answer to that quite. But I will say that I was thinking about this earlier today, and for all of the sort of moderate elite Republicans we've been hearing from in the past several months who have turned on Trump, either actively campaigned against him or actively withheld support, the sort of the old establishment Republican guard. I don't think that this is your Republican Party anymore. I'm not sure how that part of the party asserts control again. I'm not sure how. I'm sure many of them are not going to be invited back. That's for sure. That's all I have really. It just seems like that part of the party is, I think, gone. I think maybe if there had been a top to bottom decimation of the Republican Party that sort of revealed this Trumpism as a toxic thing for the party, maybe then there's something left for the old guard to take over, but I don't see it. I don't see it.
Can I jump in here? I agree. I think this is a really complex ball of wax here. That on the one hand, I think in some ways we have been witnessing a realignment in the parties. And that in particular is demonstrable by the population of people that really struggled even, at the tail end of this election cycle to make a decision. Lots of people sort of openly were surprised that there were undecided voters, but that undecided voter group, I think in large part were folks that were struggling with how they could possibly continue to support this Republican Party that is in no way recognizable to them anymore. But at the same time, I'm reminded of Reince Priebus's autopsy report back in 2016. Remember when, there was all of this public ringing the Republican Party about what happened with Romney, and Reince Priebus came back with what was actually a very thoughtful dissection of the party. And the lesson from that was that the state Republican parties had done exceedingly well at expanding their base of support, and particularly expanding into non-white voters, and in fact, incorporating many of them into the party. And by virtue of that, had at the time won 2/3 of the state legislatures and had captured 32 of the governor's positions. And that there was a lesson to be learned for the National Republican Party based upon what the states had done. And in many ways, I think that is still the truth, that for the GOP to succeed going forward, they are going to need to revisit that strategy, but it stands in such dire contrast to this core of white supremacists that has propelled and been advanced and been supported by this president. So that in many ways, we've got even a greater level of polarization and disconnect in the GOP that I just don't see being able to come back together.
Yet I wonder how you sustain that without a leader like Trump, right? So Don Jr. is not Donald Trump. There is no world in which Don Jr. is able to be his father. And I don't think it would be successful at all. So somewhere you have to have a leader who can both feed on and feed the elements Anna was talking about in the party, but also continue to get enough support from partisan Republicans who are going along because they want the policies they want, right? On the policy side, tax cuts and what have you. And it just seems to me to be a really hard, when I look at who's out there right now, it looks to me like a very heavy lift to do that. There are these elite never Trumpers and the Republican voters for against Trump and the Lincoln Project and whatever. Maybe their project is to figure out if it's actually possible to create another party in the modern era, right? I mean, another party came about in 1856, right? Is it possible? The fact that the margins, I'm struck by the fact that it was already noted that the margins in so many of these states, just as last time, are smaller than what third-party candidates, particularly a libertarian candidate in this time, got, right? There's some indication that, that libertarian view, which is not by itself necessarily a white supremacist view, right? Now, whether it is actually possible structurally to do anything is a different question, right? The system's pretty well, pretty well designed to protect the two major parties under the names that they have, right? Anybody else has a much harder time getting on the ballot or getting access to resources or anything else. But I don't think it's as clear cut that there is a leader who can step up. Now, there's some speculation, well, maybe Donald Trump will run again in 2024. But, again, I just find that really hard to imagine. But we always have a failure of imagination of what it's going to be like 4 years later, right? Who are the candidates going to be? What are the issues going to be? What's going to happen? And so, yes, the campaign is underway for 2024. The candidates are already going to Iowa, assuming the Republicans will have a first in the nation caucus. And so it's not too early. We just have no way of knowing.
I just wanted to could I briefly pick up on that? Because I've been thinking about the question of a third party as well. And I think whether that's plausible or not, I really feel that it begins to look like there are three parties now in this nation. There is this right-wing white supremacist party. There is a progressive multicultural party on the left. And then there's like the Lincoln Party in the middle. And they're the institutionalists. When you listen to the Lincoln Project people talk, they have common ground with all the Democratic Party establishment people in the belief in institutions. The right, the white supremacist right is critical of that institutional consensus. The progressive and multicultural left is critical of that, and that there really seem to be three parties. I don't know, I agree with you. It's the possibility of it happening structurally, I have no idea. It seems like a really big haul or, big ask or whatever you want to call it. But it does feel as if there are almost three groups right now.
Well, you have go ahead, Anna. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to make an additional point that I'm not sure people have realized. When we're thinking about what the future of the GOP looks like, and again, the sort of reimagining of the GOP with eye in mind to including people who had been previously excluded, one of the remarkable things that I saw this election cycle, I really did not anticipate seeing, was not only a record number of women running, right? So we know that this was also a year in which more women ran for office, building on successes clearly from 2018. But there was a number of more Republican women that were running this election cycle, and a number of Republican women of color. That was really remarkable. When you look at Latinos in places like Texas, I think, I can't recall off the top of my head, I think there were 14 Latina Republicans that were running. And this was larger than we've ever seen before. And these were competitive candidates. And in many ways, it may signal one future for the GOP, which, I would never have thought of back in 2016. But there are this growing population of GOP women who are running and who are winning, right? So for instance, in the House, we've got 10 GOP women that won House seats who are non-incumbents. And of the 5 seats that the Democrats lost, 4 of them were losses among Democratic women. 2 of them were women of color, right? And so there is, in fact, some recognition in some part of the GOP that we need to do better among women. We need one avenue to that, in particular among Latinos and African Americans, is among women of color, and that there are sort of decisive inroads that are being made along that line. Now, whether that ends up producing leadership in the GOP and producing agenda that's friendly to those populations, that's definitely still a point of discussions, because I'm not sure that they're representing those populations adequately. But it is a potential line for reinvention that I think hasn't been really mined or explored.
Thank you. We have a bunch of questions and comments I want to bring in here as well that are on this topic, which is about what each party can do going forward. So I'm going to try and kind of consolidate a few things together. Anika Wilson followed up on our initial comment to say that voter suppression is what's most scary to her. That's what she's referring to. And Sarah Vanderhagen is also asking, as a follow-up, what are the best and most realistic possibilities for combating voter suppression moving forward? And then along those lines, since we're also talking about the kind of this consolidated kind of institutional party in the middle and then the progressive wings, we had some questions about the Democratic Party too. Lane Hall is asking what you all think the Democratic Party takeaway is, upon which they'll have to create upcoming strategy. Will they see the success / failure as a necessity to stay centrist and corporate, or will they see a need to move towards more progressive caucus, grassroots organization, and leftist populist movements? Oh, this was the last thing. So Sadiel Benitez has two comments. One is the Conservative Party has to face whether they want to lean into the Trump / QAnon wing of the party versus the traditional old school conservative. Same with the Democratic Party and the moderate Joe Biden versus the progressive Bernie Sanders. So that's a lot, but I wanted to kind of catch our chat up to our discussion in here.
Well, the Democrats are already blaming each other for winning but not winning. I mean, the center and the left of the party are already bickering with each other. So I'm sure that we'll see a lot more of that.
That's a really safe prediction, Tom.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, Dave.
It's basically what Democrats do.
Yeah, that's
right?
what they do.
But of course, the constraint from a policy standpoint is going to be lack of control of the Senate. Unless they win the 2 runoff races in Georgia, not having control of the Senate means they can't do the things that the progressive side of the party wants to do, and I think could have actually gotten through things like a new Voting Rights Act as perhaps the number one first thing, right? And the challenge that the party will face is how to keep the party in Congress together in a context in which compromise will be absolutely necessary, right? Again, assuming they don't win both seats in Georgia. If they win both seats in Georgia, it's a somewhat different story, and it depends on how willing they are to play hardball and nuke the rest of the filibuster and just move forward on 50 votes plus the vice president, right? But even there, they might not have it because, we have Democrats like Manchin in West Virginia, who isn't necessarily going to sign on to a progressive agenda if he wants to keep his seat. So the challenge is very real in the immediate term on the policy side. And one of the things that Biden is very likely to face, because Obama faced it too, is a constant sniping from the left. Why didn't you do these things that you promised you would do? And I sometimes wonder if we just have this massive failure of education in America about how you actually get things done. A president doesn't wave a magic wand and say, make it so. It's not Captain Picard, right? It's got to be compromised. On the plus side, perhaps in that context, at least historically, if there's a guy who can build compromise, it may be Joe Biden, right? He has been a centrist, he has been a compromiser. The left doesn't like that, but he's done policy, not always policy people are happy with now, but he's done policy. And he also has, deep, deep roots in the Senate itself. So the Democrats might get some of the more moderate left things done, but they're going to have to give something up to do that.
I was going to say that in the absence of the Senate control, one of the things I think people are going to have to wrestle with is the fact that there is going to be a push, and if not an actual action, for Biden to lead from the executive. That in some ways, the overstretch of power that Trump prevailed over from the executive is going to provide a pathway for Biden to engage in a lot of corrective action through, executive orders, through executive action, which may not sit comfortably with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in particular. There is a lot of things that the president can do. We've seen on immigration matters, for instance, and doing things like restoring a normal asylum policy, or standard for refugees, or removing the return to Mexico policy, and doing so many things, or even the priority enforcement protocols that existed under Obama. There's so much that can be done from the administrative position, but I'm not sure is going to sit well with a base that wants a more transparent, democratic, inclusive process. So I do suspect we'll see a lot of that in the first couple years, that in the absence of Senate control, I think we are going to see a lot of this kind of administrative action. I do think that there is also going to be a real need at the state level, and David brought this up, and I want to kind of bring this back into the conversation, at the state level, to be very mindful about undoing so much of the damage that has been done on voter suppression, and particularly around racial gerrymandering. Given what's going to happen in light of the census and the redistricting, there is going to have to be a lot of concerted effort of holding states' feet to the fire, and to trying to walk back or undo dampen some of the worst effects of voter purges and restrictive ID laws and closing of voter polling locations. And so, that's definitely going to have to be a concerted focus in the next couple of years if Democrats hope to retain any sense control.
So go ahead.
Just briefly, the expansion of executive power, of course, has been going on at least since W. Bush, and probably before that. So it's Obama did his share as well. So Biden doing that has got a precedent. But I have a kind of speculative question about the Senate, and be curious what people think. I wonder if Mitch McConnell may not see this as an opportunity to really burnish his legacy. And rather than to have his legacy be as this stubborn, obstacle of anything anybody wanted to do, that whether he and Biden might find some common ground for not particularly overly progressive compromises, but actually to get some things that need to get done that just didn't get done with Trump, to try to kind of make himself look like some kind of a institutional statesman or something who's able to work when the Democrats are reasonable, he can work with them and so forth. This is my sort of fantasy, because McConnell's got what he wanted. I mean, with the control of the federal courts, Supreme and beneath that, they're pretty safe. And so this could be the next step in his kind of wanting to, make his legacy look, take some of the stink off of it, I guess. I don't know what people think, if that's possible, or whether that's just not Mitch McConnell.
I don't know. I mean, I think Mitch McConnell, I think you're right that he's essentially gotten what he wanted. And particularly if he maintains control of the Senate, he doesn't have to worry about moves to, say, expand the number of, I forget the Supreme Court, expand the number of district courts, expand the number of circuits, because these were set when the population was like half of what it was. And in fact, the administration of justice in the United States at the federal court level is extraordinarily slow because there just are not enough courts for the population. So Democrats could have made a good argument had they controlled, right, at least for expanding district and circuit courts and adding more judges at that level. But that's off the table if McConnell controls things. So maybe, right, again, I go back to the idea that Biden will be very different with Congress than even Obama was, right? I would expect Biden to be very hands-on in the efforts. I would expect, Obama was sort of aloof and didn't really do the kinds of things senators and members of Congress expect you to do, to recognize their importance in the process. And I don't think Biden has any problem with that kind of thing. Obama sent Biden to work on these things, right? So in many respects, I said this, but I think it's true. He might be the best bet Democrats could have had for getting something done. Plus, I think, Richard, your thought about McConnell might not be unreasonable, right? He's won his reelection. You know, if he still holds control, then, you know, maybe getting a few things done and looking like a hero doing so. The big problem for the parties going forward, the biggest problem that Republicans actually face right now is that their policies in general are not popular. And so, you know, we mentioned younger voters, Anna especially mentioned younger voters earlier. I don't think people understand that it wasn't inevitable that younger voters would tilt heavily Democratic. In 2000, Al Gore split the under 30 vote basically 50-50 with Bush. Right? In 2004, Kerry won them, but not by a whole lot. It was 2008 when Obama changed everything when it came to young voters. Of course, they're not young voters anymore, right? They're in their 30s and 40s now. But the point here is that this was not inevitable, but the policies of the Republican Party and then Trumpism, I think you'll just put the nail in the coffin for the Republicans and young voters in the near term. For them to survive, they've got to find out how to go back to the 50-50 world, not the 70-30 world.
I tend to think that the kind of politics of outrage is going to prevail in the GOP for the next couple of years, that this is going to be their strategy moving into midterms, that the kind of soul searching and hopefully reconstruction that we would, I think, all wish for may not happen until 2024, may not happen until we see candidates trying to really emerge as consensus candidates in the party, whether it be Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or whomever. I think for the next 2 years, it's going to be resist, 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 outrage, 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 and block everything that may seem reasonable coming out of the Democratic Party. And so I really am not looking very hopefully to Congress as a site for productive legislation. Again, I think it's going to end up falling in the hands of administrative authority, and we're going to see a lot more coming out of policy memos and executive orders.
Okay, a couple of things I want to bring in to play catch up in our comments. Well, first of all, Saudi El Benitez has a follow-up to just this topic, saying, I think it's possible that instead of gridlocking in the Senate, McConnell can just feign bipartisanship but then have policies be struck down in the Supreme Court. That does indeed seem possible. The two questions I want to bring in, though, change the subject a bit to be more about media. And so obviously everyone is welcome to comment. I think Richard might be interested in replying to this too. An earlier comment from Spashak is, I'd love to hear reactions to Trump's statement last night. And I assume they're referring to the one that most major news networks just cut away from, saying that it was lies after a minute or two. And relatedly, Douglas Haynes is asking, does everyone think that the media's willingness to identify presidential deceit will continue in the Biden era and beyond? Is there a permanent new erosion of deference to presidential authority?
Well,
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Richard.
I was just going to say, I don't have anything. Go ahead.
Oh, no. It will be interesting under a Biden administration where there'll be sort of less extreme language coming out, probably a stiffer dose of sort of straightforwardness coming out. But I suspect that the media will be more than happy to hold his feet to the fire. And I suspect that a lot of Biden supporters will feel almost as if there's a double standard, because seemingly innocuous things that Biden will say, or that his representatives will say, or that people he appoints that they do or say, will probably attract a lot of negative attention in the press, whereas these were pretty minor occurrences during the Trump administration. So I'm sure, and when you're on the outside, and your person's getting hit. And you always think, that you're being treated unfairly, but I'm sure the media are not in the mood necessarily to give Biden a lot of breaks on this front. I guess what I'm saying.
So Tom, you don't think, or others, that the media will or has bought into the civility model, and that they are so desirous of returning to an era where there was some kind of conventional respect between media and the executive, and where there was some more open communication? You don't think that that's going to sort of cause
Well, I think they'll feel more comfortable going to the White House, but I also think that they're selling airspace, and and there's a political version of it. If it bleeds, it leads, and that's scandal. That's accusations of scandal. That's playing the watchdog, and I think they'll be engaged in that. It'll be at a different level. I mean, what they're having to police will be very different. And I think that probably they will feel much more comfortable in their relationship with the Biden presidency. But nobody's clicking that link if it's a story about good day at the office for Joe Biden today.
Yeah, that's true. I think, although I do think that the media will lose money under Biden. I mean, the New York Times just announced they have 7 million now digital subscribers, the highest total ever. And I think that number is going to go down during the Biden years.
Sure. There's no traffic accident to watch.
I do think that there is going to be a different population that the media is both cognizant of and reaching towards. In many ways, I think the biggest challenge for Biden's administration is going to be what to do with this progressive segment of the population that has been tapped, that has been mobilized, that really turned out for Sanders in particular, and that has sort of begrudgingly joined this Biden coalition. And that population is, I think, going to be in part who many of these media outlets have not reached previously, but are going to be reaching for, are going to be cognizant for, and are going to be writing for in many ways. And that population, I have no doubt, is going to be incredibly critical of, scrutinizing of, and mindful of what comes out of this administration on everything from racial justice and immigration reform to gun control legislation. And so I do think that there's going to be an internal dynamic that pushes the media, despite what I have no doubt it is a desire for a return to normalcy, if not some nostalgia for a more romantic period of, say, West Wing-like communication. I have no doubt that that exists really powerfully for people. I certainly feel it myself, but I do think Tom is right. This is the need and desire to continue to reach an audience, if nothing else for subscriptions and for readership, is going to ultimately propel them towards more criticism and reaching for these populations that are generating different types of criticism for this administration.
Well, and there's a ongoing theme of Democrats in disarray in the media. It just all the time, right? The Democrats are in disarray. They're in disarray over this, that, or the other. And there's some truth to that. It's again, the nature of the party. But there are going to be plenty of opportunities to talk about that because, again, I think the progressive left is going to be very frustrated because, the policies they want are not going to magically appear. The centrist part of the party, so there'll be this battle between the progressive left say, well, see, we told you if we'd only nominated Bernie Sanders, we'd get everything we wanted, or Elizabeth Warren, we'd get everything we wanted. And the centrist part of the party, the institutionalist part of the party, whatever you want to call them, is going to be in this battle back and forth about, well, here's what's realistic. Here's what can really be done. Let me use the word pragmatic, maybe even better. The pragmatic, because that's where Biden is. He's always been in the pragmatic wing of the party. He is a liberal, despite what people sometimes think, and despite some things that played as a representative for the state of Delaware, 25, 30, God, however many years ago. He's basically a liberal, but he's a pragmatic liberal. And that is the battle in the party. It's kind of a pragmatism versus the progressive left. And, you know, we talked briefly about in Congress, but the longer term for the Democratic Party between now and the midterm, and then between now and the next presidential election, is going to continue to be that internal battle. And it may get heated. It may give the media plenty of stuff to cover, right? And plenty of opportunities to talk, again, about Democrats in disarray.
Can I just say one more thing, which was about that statement that, well, the press conference last night, right? So, you know, obviously that was a particularly new low. But what was remarkable, obviously, was the networks cutting off and, you know, basically engaging in this sort of immediate fact checking, but refusing to cover. And then subsequently, lots of the cable networks then either cut off or did their own fact checking, or then refused to replay. So that I thought was welcome, if not late. But what I was most surprised at is what then turned out this morning. So I don't know if everybody saw this morning, then the president actually issued a statement. It wasn't a tweet. It was a statement that came from the White House that I have to say was, I think, probably the most composed statement I have seen from the White House in 5 years. You know, in not only, I should say, 4 years plus the Trump previous, you know, run for president. It is the most composed statement I have ever seen from Trump. And it is a kind of repudiation of the election system, but in language that is actually not openly racist, it's destructive, right? It is remarkable. And it struck me after reading that, is this what it took? Is this what it took to have a White House actually issue statements in a language that could not be quite so, I mean, it definitely is coming to conflict with the electoral system, but it is not the kind of vitriol that we saw for years and years and years coming out of Twitter. And it struck me that that was a direct effect of what had happened the day before and the strictures put on place by Twitter, Facebook, as well as the network news refusing to kind of carry his screed.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, in some ways, the trolls have already been fed, right? So there's that to contend with. We have another question, which is actually taking us back to our earlier conversation on the divisions within the Republican Party. So I'll just throw it out there. Is there any data on these never Trump Republicans that are aligned with the Lincoln Party ideas? I saw that voters for Trump within his party, I presume during this election cycle, went up from 90% to 93%. So I think that's a question about, like, did the Lincoln Party actually have an impact on what it attempted to impact, which was Republican voting patterns from 2016 to 2020.
Yeah, I was just looking at this before we went on air. It was really high party loyalty on both sides this time around. I was a little bit surprised, because what we're hearing on the Republican side is there's this wing of the party that's not happy with Trump, and they're very visible, but they're evidently not much of the rank and file, because 93% might be right. I thought it was even a little higher. Democrats were the same. Democrats are usually a little less loyal, but they were right in there as well. So I was a little bit surprised by that. I thought maybe there'd be more defection. And it wasn't a matter of there were fewer Republicans. The percent of the electorate that's Republican is about the same as it was last time. So I found that kind of surprising. And I wonder if it is maybe an indication that we take this very visible, very loud segment of the Republican Party that's anti-Trump and sort of in our minds make a bigger deal of them than they really constitute. I think that's a possibility.
But isn't it also possible that we take the white supremacists, whatever, the really hardcore Trumpers as also a larger part of the party? I mean, Ron Johnson, the execrable senator from Wisconsin, said that the terrible thing is that 50% of the American electorate will not accept a Biden presidency. And I think that's bullshit, because I think what you're saying, Tom, about party loyalty is I think that Trump got all those votes, not because they're all feel like it's all corrupt and all those things, but because these people have been Republicans their whole life. They
They're
go,
Republican. Yeah,
they
exactly.
go to the polls and they pull the Republican lever. So I think there's an activist, core of, young fascists or whatever, who are going to be unhappy. But I think the bulk of the Republicans who voted for Trump will probably just accept that, well, sometimes you lose. I don't know. That's my sense.
So I would, the trick here is, firstly, we'd be a little bit careful about the exit polls right now, because these are still not final exit polls adjusted for the actual results, which exit polls are. But on top of that, exit polling methodology is not the same as it used to be, because mail-in voting, 100 million mail-in votes and early votes in person, it's a very different kind of electorate.
As an early voter, I was part of the Edison survey this time.
Yeah, no, they're attempting to reach out, absolutely, right? But it's still not the same methodology it once was. And I think, Anna made the point earlier about, which is really important, and Edison itself has said this, about using exit polls for smaller subpopulations is really problematic because of the methodologies that are used. So, and as the Latino Decisions folks, Matt Barreto, constantly make this point over and over again. So I'd be careful about the exit polls, but I would also argue that the people most susceptible to Lincoln Project aren't going to show up as Republicans. They're going to show up as independents. And we're not really going to know for sure if they might have been willing to call themselves Republicans, except for the world that we're in right now. And we're also not going to know for sure if the Lincoln Project nudged them because Biden did far better among independents, to the extent we know so far, than Hillary Clinton did. So it's just really hard to tell. But the people who call themselves Republicans or Democrats, particularly on the first line, first time they're asked, are, they're voting the party line. And it really doesn't even matter who's there, I think.
So we have, those are all the questions we had, actually. I wonder if people want to do some closing comments. Richard, what do you think? You're muted.
Yeah, if people want to kind of wrap up, I think one question we haven't thought about or talked about at all is what does happen between now and Inauguration Day, both in terms of Trump just, sort of cleaning house and firing all the people he wanted to fire. But also, I asked on social media whether the first act of President Biden after his inauguration is going to be to order the military to remove Trump from the White House. And then other people say, no, he'll already be out of the country by then. So I don't know. I'm curious about that, and also about Trump going forward. Back to the media question, I was going to throw in that many people think he will just go to the Trump TV network. And in terms of the media being critical of Biden and holding his feet to the fire, if Trump does establish this Trump TV, they will do nothing but hold Biden to the fire. So anyway, a couple things to throw out about what lies ahead. I don't know if anybody wants to think about that.
One thing I was thinking about as we were winding down here is there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done in the next few months. There's a lot of work to be done. And the transition process is really important to this, and I have no idea what that's going to be like. And that could, in normal times, you have a high level of cooperation. Maybe they don't like each other, but they cooperate. I can't imagine that's going to work out that way this time. But more generally, I think the executive branch has been decimated. After 4 years, I think there are a lot of executive positions that are still waiting to be filled and never filled, or they had acting people, departments that were really neglected for a long time. And I just think that administratively, there's a lot of work to be done here. And this is, sort of one area where I see, the Democratic Party is sort of starting to bicker a little bit about who should get what. And my advice to them is get really competent people who know how to administer things, because that's going to be really important in those first few months in office. And if that satisfies one wing or the other, fine. But, I don't think this is a place for people to have their first administrative position, because it's really going to be important to get really good people into those positions. So that's what I am sort of thinking about between now and then, although, all the points you make, Richard, are important and in some ways a little scary too. But I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I'll second that, right? Administrative competence is critically important at this point. There's a certain amount of the transition that's been already underway, and it happens at lower levels in the bureaucracy, and there are well-designed processes for this. There are, basically manuals for doing it. Essentially, that's been underway because that always starts before the actual election, no matter what. So at that level, I'm actually reasonably competent at basically the career level, right? That the transition part of this will be okay. I don't expect that Donald Trump will cooperate in any way, but I'm not sure the president is all that necessary to the transition, the outgoing president. And in terms of higher level political appointees, yeah, Trump may fire them all, just save the Biden the trouble of doing it. So, in some sense, it's really hard to figure out where this is going in the next 2.5 months, right? But it does point out that we seriously consider whether we should have 2.5-month transitions in the modern world. In the UK, they hold an election. The party that wins, the leader, the next day walks into number 10 Downing Street and is the prime minister, period. Right? Most sensible democracies transition very, very quickly. And this again is it would take some work to change it, so it'll probably never change. But nonetheless, we're going to learn that this transition period doesn't really make that much sense.
I really appreciate Richard's question, because I've been thinking about this daily, that this is an administration, and particularly a president, that is deeply motivated by racial resentment, by a deep sense of masculine injury, that has proven his willingness time and time again to engage in unwanted retribution, particularly against people who he thinks have wronged him, and in this case, whole states and cities, right? And there is a lot of damage that can be done between now and January 20th. And I worry seriously about his willingness to be just unleashed in these next 2 months. We saw just in the few months leading up to this election, his willingness to really unleash ICE officers in what are otherwise known as sanctuary cities. And really that did not receive virtually any media coverage. The fact that there were continual raids that were happening, and they were very targeted raids, and in many cases even forms of retaliatory raids that were being targeted against DACA recipients, against Latinos who were organizing in places like Maricopa County, in places like Nevada. And I fully expect to see that same kind of retaliatory measures deployed by this administration in the next 2 months. We also saw this failure to provide for financial relief in California, my home state, over the summer, precisely because of that, aggrandized sense of injury. And I expect to see that. And probably most importantly, there is still this raging COVID crisis, and we're entering into what is arguably the most dangerous period going into this winter. We desperately need leadership. And I would not be surprised to see this president just check out and go play golf for the next 2 months and issue these, retaliatory tweets and policy recommendations, but also fail to provide any leadership at a time when we absolutely need it most. And so I worry about the kind of damage that can be done in the next 2 months, and really the levels of exhaustion that we're all experiencing need to sort of be mitigated a bit, but also we need to be vigilant for these next 2 months, because there's so much damage that can still be done.
Yeah, absolutely. two final comments, one echoing the other. Lane Hall is saying in the comments on our YouTube channel that we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Jenny Keel is agreeing it might be necessary to restore accountability and legitimacy. I mean, I don't see that as I don't know if that's that's actually going to happen, but it does seem like there needs to be some kind of grappling with the past 4 years and the fundamental changes to our institution that Donald Trump has and his administration have wrought. So yeah, thank you for that, Lane and Jenny. It's a little after 5. I think we need to wrap it up. I'm so grateful to all of our panelists, Dr. Anna Sampaio, Tom Holbrook, and David Redlawsk, and our moderator, of course, Richard Grusin.
Thanks. It was great.
Thank you, everybody.
Nice.
And nice to see you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hoping that we've got an end to the drama today.
Yeah.
I need some
Oh, yeah.
rest. I need some sleep.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yes, we all made it to Friday afternoon, so cheers, everybody. Go take a break. Thank you very much for joining us. C21 will be back here next Friday, 3:30 p.m. for a conversation with Neil Ahuja about climate refugees. So we will see you then.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.